Picture this. You're standing on a blood-soaked battlefield in Germania. Year 9 AD, 3 entire Roman legions are being massacred in the Teutoburg forest. Everywhere you look, Roman soldiers are falling, screaming, dying. But here's the thing that made even their enemies tremble with fear. Even as these warriors fell, their armor kept fighting back. Some Germanic warriors shattered their own weapons trying to penetrate it. Others watched in absolute horror as their strongest strikes simply bounced off like raindrops on stone. What made Roman armor so impossibly, terrifyingly effective that it turned ordinary men into walking fortresses? If you love discovering the brutal truths behind ancient warfare and the ingenious innovations that conquered the world, smash that like button right now. And drop a comment. Which would you rather face in battle? A Roman legionary in full armor? Or 3 unarmored barbarian warriors? Your answer might surprise you by the end of this video. Let's rewind to the year 200 BC. Rome isn't yet the unstoppable empire that will dominate the known world. They're just one power among many, constantly fighting for survival against Carthaginians, Greeks, Gauls, and dozens of other fierce civilizations. But here's what set them apart from every other army that ever existed. They didn't just train soldiers, they engineered them. Roman military thinking was revolutionary and brutally practical. While other ancient warriors relied on courage, individual skill, or sheer numbers, Romans asked a different question. How do we make our soldiers literally indestructible? The answer they developed would terrify enemies for over 5 centuries and influence military technology for 2,000 years. We're talking about the evolution of Roman armor, from basic protection to the most sophisticated personal defensive system the ancient world had ever witnessed. And here's the insane part. They didn't just stumble upon this technology. They systematically researched it, tested it in real combat, improved it based on battlefield feedback, and mass-produced it with industrial efficiency that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Rome essentially created the first military-industrial complex in human history, and armor was at its absolute core. Let's start with what came before the legendary Lorica Segmentata. Early Roman soldiers back in the days of the Republic wore simple chainmail called Lorica hamata. Now, don't let the word simple fool you. This armor was an absolute nightmare to produce and a marvel of ancient engineering. Picture this. Each suit contained approximately 20,000 to 40,000 individual iron rings. Yes, you heard that right. 20 to 40,000 rings, each one meticulously crafted, linked, and riveted by hand. A single suit of Lorica hamata took one skilled armorer between 200 to 300 hours of painstaking labor to complete. That's essentially 2 months of full-time work for one piece of armor. The cost? Astronomical. In today's money, we're talking about $15,000 to $20,000 per suit. And a legion needed thousands of them. The economic engine required to outfit a Roman legion was staggering, comparable to the cost of maintaining a modern tank division. But here's what made it worth every single denarius. The protection was phenomenal. The chainmail weighed around 15 to 20 pounds and covered the torso, shoulders, and often extended to mid-thigh. When a sword struck it, the interlocked rings distributed the force across hundreds of connection points. Slashing attacks? Completely ineffective. Stabbing attacks? Extremely difficult unless you hit the exact weak point where rings joined. Arrows? They'd penetrate occasionally, but the mail would often catch them, preventing deep wounds. Roman soldiers wearing Lorica hamata survived wounds that would have been instantly fatal otherwise. Historical accounts from battles against the Gauls describe warriors hacking at Roman soldiers for minutes on end, their swords ringing against the mail like blacksmiths at an anvil, while the Romans calmly maintained formation and systematically cut down their exhausted attackers. The psychological warfare aspect here was devastating. Imagine being a Gallic warrior putting everything you have into strikes that should kill a man, and watching your enemy just stand there unharmed, almost mocking your efforts with their casual efficiency. But the Romans weren't satisfied. They were obsessed with perfection, with creating the ultimate warrior. In the 1st century AD, probably around 2030 AD, Roman engineers developed something unprecedented, something that would make modern military scientists nod in appreciation: the Lorica Segmentata. This was armor reimagined from the ground up. Instead of chainmail's flexibility, they created a system of overlapping iron strips, each one about 2 inches wide, curved to fit the human torso perfectly. These strips were connected by internal leather straps and secured with brass or iron fittings. The entire assembly consisted of approximately 30 to 40 individual metal strips, creating what was essentially a personal iron cage that moved with the warrior's body. The engineering sophistication here is absolutely mind-blowing. Each strip overlapped its neighbor by about half an inch, creating a scale-like effect where any attack would hit at least 2 layers of metal. The overlap pattern was carefully designed so that no matter what angle an enemy struck from, they'd face multiple barriers. The shoulder guards were particularly ingenious. They provided massive protection for the vulnerable neck and upper chest area, while still allowing complete freedom of movement for throwing javelins or swinging swords. But here's where Roman engineering genius really shows. They understood material science in ways that seem almost impossible for ancient technology. The iron strips weren't uniform in thickness. The outer layers were slightly harder, designed to resist penetration, while the inner layers were more flexible to absorb impact energy. This layered defense system is the exact same principle used in modern composite armor for tanks and body armor for soldiers. The Romans figured this out 2,000 years ago through systematic trial and error on actual battlefields. The weight distribution was revolutionary. While Lorica hamata hung from the shoulders, putting tremendous strain on the upper body, Lorica segmentata distributed its weight more evenly across the entire torso. A suit weighed only about 20 to 25 pounds, actually lighter than chainmail, yet it provided superior protection. Roman soldiers could march 20 miles a day in this armor, fight a brutal battle, then march another 10 miles to camp. The endurance advantage this gave Rome was absolutely crushing. Testing showed that Lorica segmentata could stop arrows that would punch clean through chainmail. It could deflect sword strikes that would shatter bone even through mail. Against axes, probably the most dangerous weapon Romans faced, the segmented design caused the blade to skip off rather than bite in, turning potentially fatal strikes into glancing blows that barely left bruises. The Romans had created armor that didn't just protect, it actively defeated attacks through intelligent design. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The Romans didn't stop at just the body armor. They understood that protection meant nothing if your limbs were vulnerable or your vision was compromised. So they developed an entire system of integrated protection that worked together like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of death prevention. The helmet, the gallia, was a masterpiece of protective design that would influence military helmets for millennia. It featured a bowl that covered the entire skull, a wide neck guard that protected against strikes from behind, cheek guards that could stop a sword aimed at the face, and a reinforced brow ridge that deflected downward strikes away from the eyes. Some versions included cross-bracing inside the bowl for additional structural support against crushing blows that could kill through concussion even without penetrating the helmet itself. The psychological impact was immense too. These helmets, often decorated with crests and plumes, made Romans look taller, more imposing, absolutely terrifying to face across a battlefield. The plumes served a practical purpose as well. They made it easier to identify officers and maintain formation cohesion in the chaos of battle. But they also made each soldier look like they stood 7 feet tall, creating an impression of superhuman size that could break enemy morale before the first sword was drawn. The shield, the scutum, deserves special mention because it was as much a weapon as a defensive tool. This curved rectangular shield stood about 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, large enough to cover a soldier from shoulder to knee. It was made from 3 layers of wooden strips glued together in different directions for maximum strength, covered with canvas and leather, and edged with metal. The center featured an iron or bronze boss that could be used as a devastating punch weapon in close combat. But here's the genius. The curvature wasn't just for style. It provided superior deflection of missiles and allowed shields to overlap in formation, creating an almost impenetrable wall. The weight distribution meant a soldier could hold it for hours without exhaustion. and the size meant that when Romans formed the famous testudo, or tortoise formation, they created a mobile armored box that could advance under the heaviest arrow fire with minimal casualties. Ancient writers describe seeing Roman testudo formations advance through storms of arrows that blackened the sky, with the missiles bouncing off the shield wall like hail on a roof, while the Romans underneath marched forward without a single casualty. Romans also wore greaves on their shins, manacas on their arms, for gladiator-style combat, and various other protective pieces depending on their role and time period. Every vulnerable point was considered, analyzed, and protected. The result was a soldier who was so thoroughly armored that killing him in combat became an exercise in frustration and futility for his enemies. Now here's where the true genius of Roman armor reveals itself. In the most violent, spectacular way possible. Let's jump to the Battle of Watling Street in 61 AD. Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni, has raised the largest British rebellion Rome has ever faced. Her forces number somewhere between 100,000 to 230,000 warriors. The ancient sources vary, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. They've already destroyed 3 Roman cities, killed 70,000 Roman citizens and allies, and they're hungry for more blood. The streets of Londinium ran red with Roman blood. Entire settlements were burned to ash. This wasn't just a rebellion. It was an attempted genocide. Facing them? Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus with approximately 10,000 Roman soldiers. The odds are 20 to 1, possibly worse. Any rational person would look at these numbers and declare the Roman force doomed. The Britons certainly thought so. According to the historian Tacitus, they were so confident of victory that they brought their families in wagons to watch the Romans be slaughtered. They positioned these wagons in a massive semicircle behind their army to serve as viewing stands for the massacre they were about to witness. They brought food, drink, and prepared to celebrate what they believed would be the end of Roman Britain. Suetonius chose his battlefield with brutal calculation, a narrow defile with a forest at his back and steep sides, forcing the Britons to attack on a narrow front where their massive numerical advantage became meaningless. The Romans stood in their classic triple-line formation, shields locked, armor gleaming in the British sun, absolutely motionless, waiting. The discipline alone was terrifying. 10,000 men standing in perfect silence while over 100,000 screaming warriors prepared to destroy them. The Britons charged in a massive wave, screaming their war cries, hundreds of thousands strong, believing their sheer numbers would simply overwhelm and crush the thin Roman line like a tsunami destroying a sandcastle. The ground literally shook under the weight of their charge. The noise was deafening. War horns, screams, the thunder of thousands of feet. It must have looked like the end of the world descending on that thin Roman line. What happened next defied all logic and expectation. The Romans didn't break. They didn't even bend. Standing in their perfect formations, protected by their sophisticated armor, they were like an immovable object facing an unstoppable force. And impossibly, the immovable object won. The Britons crashed against the Roman lines like ocean waves against a cliff. They hacked, stabbed, battered, and smashed against Roman shields and armor with everything they had. Some ancient British weapons literally shattered against Roman armor. Swords snapped, axe heads flew off, spear points bent uselessly. Warriors who had trained their entire lives for battle found their most powerful strikes accomplishing nothing except ringing impacts that numbed their arms and sent shock waves up their bones. Meanwhile, the Romans worked with mechanical efficiency, their short swords flashing out from behind their shields. Each thrust calculated, each movement conserved, each kill methodical. The gladius was designed specifically for this type of close-quarters combat, short enough to use in tight formations, sharp enough to slip between ribs, wielded by men whose armor let them take risks that would be suicidal for unprotected warriors. The armor didn't just protect them, it gave them absolute confidence. When you know your enemy literally cannot hurt you through your defenses, when you've seen their strongest warriors exhaust themselves trying to penetrate your armor, you don't feel fear. You feel invincible. and that psychological edge was as important as the physical protection. Roman soldiers could afford to take their time, to be precise, to conserve energy while their enemies burned themselves out in futile fury. For hours the slaughter continued. The Britons kept coming, kept dying. Their numerical advantage meant nothing when they couldn't hurt their enemies. The narrow battlefield became a killing ground, where British courage met Roman engineering and was systematically destroyed. Bodies piled so high that new attackers had to climb over the corpses of their fallen comrades to reach the Roman lines, and still they couldn't break through. The Romans rotated fresh men to the front, while exhausted fighters rested behind the line, another tactical innovation that their armor made possible. If you're not constantly worried about being wounded, you can fight until you're physically tired rather than until you're dead. Fresh Romans replaced tired ones in a continuous cycle, while the Britons had no such luxury. Their warriors fought until they died or collapsed from exhaustion, with no relief, no respite, just endless waves breaking against an unbreakable wall. Eventually the British attack faltered, then broke completely. What followed was one of the most one-sided slaughters in military history. As the Britons tried to flee, they found their escape blocked by their own wagons, the same wagons they'd brought to watch the Roman defeat. Those viewing stands became death traps. According to Tacitus, 80,000 Britons died that day. The Roman casualties? Around 400 dead, slightly more wounded. Think about that ratio for a moment. 20-to-1 odds going into battle, 200-to-1 casualty ratio coming out. That's not just military skill, that's technological superiority so overwhelming it seems impossible. It's like watching medieval knights fight against Bronze Age warriors, except this all happened within the same time period, on the same island, with the same basic metallurgy available to both sides. The difference was entirely in how Romans thought about warfare and protection. But the true test of Roman armor wasn't just in massive battles like Watling Street. It was in the daily, grinding horror of frontier warfare. Along the German frontier, in the forests of Britannia, in the deserts of Judea, Roman soldiers faced ambushes, guerrilla attacks, and desperate close quarters combat where armor meant the difference between going home or becoming another forgotten grave in hostile territory. Consider the Battle of Beth Horon in 66 AD during the First Jewish Revolt. A Roman force was ambushed in a narrow mountain pass by Jewish rebels. The Romans were caught in arguably the worst tactical situation possible, strung out in marching column, unable to form proper battle lines, being shot at from above by enemies with superior positions. The battle turned into a running fight through impossible terrain where Roman discipline and training advantages were minimized. Yet even in this nightmare scenario, Roman armor saved countless lives. Soldiers who would have been killed by the first arrow barrage survived, regrouped, and eventually fought their way out. Arrows that should have been fatal wounds became painful but survivable injuries. Strikes that should have opened arteries glanced off armor plates. The force was mauled, certainly, losing baggage, supplies, and suffering heavy casualties by Roman standards. But it wasn't annihilated as it would have been without their superior protection. Thousands of Romans survived that ambush specifically because their armor kept them alive long enough to fight back and escape. In siege warfare, Roman armor proved equally crucial. During the siege of Masada, Romans built enormous siege ramps under constant fire from defenders above. Workers were protected by armored shields, and the soldiers covering them wore full armor even in the brutal desert heat. The defenders threw everything down on them: stones, arrows, burning oil, heavy timbers. Yet the Romans kept building, kept advancing, their armor turning what should have been certain death into survivable danger. It was like trying to kill robots with primitive weapons. No matter how much damage you inflicted, they just kept coming. The dominance of Roman armor continued for centuries, evolving and adapting to new threats. When facing the Parthian cataphracts with their powerful bows and armor-piercing arrows, Romans added additional armor pieces and developed better quality steel. When fighting in hot climates like North Africa or the Middle East, they modified designs for better ventilation, adding more perforations and adjusting how weight was distributed. When economic pressures made the expensive Segmentata less practical, they returned to improved versions of chainmail that incorporated lessons learned from centuries of warfare. By the 3rd century AD, Lorica segmentata was being gradually phased out in favor of improved chainmail and scale armor, not because it was inferior, but because it was too complex and expensive to maintain as the empire's economic situation deteriorated. The new armor was still incredibly effective, still far superior to anything Rome's enemies possessed, but it was a step backward from the peak engineering perfection that segmentata represented. But here's the tragic irony that ended Rome's armored supremacy. It wasn't defeated by better technology. It was defeated by economics and social collapse. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the sophisticated infrastructure required to produce, maintain, and distribute advanced armor broke down. The mines that produced quality iron became inaccessible. The specialized armorers died without passing on their knowledge. The roads that distributed armor to frontier legions fell into disrepair. The tax system that funded armor production collapsed. The knowledge of how to make Lorica segmentata was actually lost for over 1,000 years. Medieval Europeans would have been absolutely amazed by the engineering sophistication of Roman armor if they'd fully understood it. When archaeologists first discovered segmentata pieces in the 19th century, it took them decades to figure out how the armor actually went together. The level of engineering was so advanced that modern scholars couldn't immediately understand it. The last Roman soldiers defending Rome in 476 AD still wore armor descended from designs created centuries earlier. Even in the empire's final moments, even as barbarian kingdoms carved up Roman territory, Roman armor remained superior to anything their enemies possessed. But superior equipment could not save an empire that had lost the economic and social foundations to produce that equipment at scale. A Roman legionary from 100 AD transported to 476 AD would barely recognize the ragtag force defending Rome, but he'd still see the ghost of Roman superiority in their equipment. By the 6th century, the sophisticated segmentata had completely vanished from use. Medieval knights would eventually develop plate armor that exceeded Roman technology, but it took nearly 1,000 years to recover and surpass what Rome had achieved. Think about that. Human civilization regressed for a millennium in terms of personal armor technology. The Roman armor revolution was so advanced, so far ahead of its time, that when their civilization fell, military technology actually went backward for centuries. So what's the real lesson here about Roman armor? It's not just about iron strips and brass fittings. It's about what happens when a civilization commits absolutely and totally to engineering superiority. The Romans didn't just make soldiers. They created a system where training, tactics, and technology formed an unbreakable triangle of military dominance. Their armor worked because it was part of a comprehensive approach to warfare that considered logistics, economics, battlefield psychology, and long-term strategic thinking. Every other ancient civilization focused on making better warriors. Rome focused on making warriors impossible to kill. That's the difference between fighting to win and engineering victory as an inevitable outcome. Standing on a battlefield facing a Roman legion in full armor must have been absolutely soul-crushing. You're looking at men who are essentially encased in iron, who have trained together for years, who are backed by the wealthiest empire in the world, and who know from experience that you probably can't hurt them even if you get lucky. How do you fight an enemy that your weapons barely scratch? How do you maintain morale when the warriors next to you are dying by the dozens, while the Romans barely have scratches? How do you keep charging when every instinct screams that this is futile? The might of Roman armor wasn't just in the metal. It was in the message it sent. It said, "We have invested thousands of hours and enormous resources into protecting each of these soldiers. We value them so much that we've given them the best protection human ingenuity can devise. We're not here to take risks. We're here to win through inevitable, overwhelming, engineered superiority." And for 5 centuries, that message echoed across battlefields from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, whispered in terror around barbarian campfires and spoken with awe in civilized courts. The Roman legions were proof that intelligence beats courage, that engineering beats bravery, that systematic thinking beats heroic individualism. They were walking embodiments of why Rome conquered the world, not because Romans were somehow genetically superior or more courageous, but because they thought differently about problems. They saw warfare as an engineering challenge to be solved rather than a test of masculine virtue to be endured. Now I want to know what you think. If you could take one innovation from Roman armor and apply it to modern military equipment, what would it be? The integrated protection system? The weight distribution? The psychological impact of appearance? Drop your answer in the comments and let's discuss how ancient engineering still influences modern warfare. And if you want more deep dives into the technology that built and destroyed empires, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started uncovering the brutal truth behind ancient military innovation that changed the course of human history.